Welcome to Health Systems CIO's interview with Jacki Monson, SVP, Chief Integration Officer, and Chief Privacy Officer with Sutter Health. I'm Anthony Guerra, founder and editor-in-chief. Jacki, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, very good. You want to start off by telling me about your organization and your roles?
Absolutely. So based at Sutter Health, it's a large integrated healthcare delivery system in Northern California. We have around 61,000 workforce members, 22 hospitals, and lots of ambulatory and ambulatory surgical locations. My role is the Chief Integration Officer, and I also have privacy, but most of my role is focused on integration. Integrating the people, the process, and the technology from our M&A activity to transforming us from a holding company to an operating company and everything in between. I have a portfolio of around $600 million worth of projects, initiatives, operational efficiencies for the organization that I help drive with business owners to then allow us to reinvest in growth in the organization.
So your integration's at a different level than a lot of times what we think of when I'm having these conversations with people when we're talking about integrating two applications from different vendors and we talk about fire and exchange standards and all that. That's kind of not exactly what we're talking about with your title.
No, it's
Yeah,
not technical integration per
right.
se. It's broader, high-level strategy, people process technology. So if we last year we acquired radiology practices, and so it's integrating the people or the employees, all the technology. So oftentimes they're on different systems than we are. And then the process, so that on day one, when we close that transaction, we can see all the patients that we acquire.
So obviously, when you're doing integration, I mean, technology is a huge component of it. So you'll be working with the CIO and the CTO on that element. And obviously, they're even at a much higher level than application, although that is going to fall under their purview. And eventually, somebody's going to be doing that. So a technology would be a component of the integration you're working on, the larger level integration. And then the CIO is going to handle the technology part of that, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So the team, the CIO gets involved, and we look at the entire portfolio of technology, everything from what would be an exam room to the actual applications to do they have AI like we do or not, and then basically come up with a plan to integrate it. And often technology is the most complicated piece. One of the I think lessons learned that the industry has had with the Change Healthcare incident, which I have the privilege of having been the CISO here for a really long time, is that it's a non-negotiable for us to make sure that security is our security on day one of these transactions. And I think when you saw the Change Healthcare incident, they didn't actually have that. They didn't integrate the security in a lot of the technology. And so that's one things that we focus on to mitigate some of the risk is making sure that even if we don't have all of our technology integrated, so we had a transaction a couple of years ago that we're still not fully deployed on Epic, our version of Epic, but we have all of our cybersecurity and security tech stack deployed on day one.
Yeah, so the day one idea is interesting when it comes to M&A, and I've covered this a little bit, and it seems like there are stages. There are certain things you can do when you're doing your due diligence, and there's information you're going to be able to get. There's information you're going to ask for. You may not get it, but there's only so much that you can do before the deal is closed in order to decide if you want to go forward with the deal. Then there's a period of time after the deal's closed when you're, I guess, technically you have ownership of the new hospital, let's say, for example, here. But before you fully integrated the IT system, so there's no real danger to the original entity because you don't have data flowing, you have some protection. And then there could be a stage after that when you finally start the data flowing. Now after you've owned it, you have had more time to really look at things as opposed to beforehand when you could just ask to be provided. Do you see M&A in terms of stages somewhat like that?
Yeah, I definitely see it as stages, and I think it depends on what type of transaction it is. Like the one that I gave you the example of was a bankruptcy transaction, and so there was no ability to get TSAs for technology. On day one, we had to be live with all of our technology to see the patients. And that's unique. And that's, an 80-day or less type of integration. Whereas something where we have more time to evaluate it. Just from my own experience on the due diligence piece of this, due diligence often happens very quickly, and you don't actually have a lot of details on what it is until you close the transaction and then could get more details. So we try to balance that back and forth. We've actually been, when you get into due diligence, it's overwhelming, all of the data. So one of the things we've been looking at is how do you use artificial intelligence to actually analyze the data at a quicker pace to get us what we need to inform how we're going to integrate. But from my experience over the last couple of years, we often close the transaction or get close to closing it, and then we end up doing what I call operational integration due diligence, which is, okay, what do we actually have and what do we need to do? And then how do we put the roadmap in place to get where we need to go, and how quickly can we do it? So obviously, the greater the synergies, the greater the information sharing, the better it is for patients at the end of the day.
So, you talk about bringing AI to bear on due diligence. It's a fascinating time to be alive, however you want to put it.
Yeah.
And it's almost this interesting dynamic where now you have to keep in the back of your head whether or not it makes sense to try and bring AI to bear on whatever you might be doing, right?
Yeah.
Because you might forget. It's like when you're talking to someone and they say, I don't know. And you're like, well, Google it on your phone. Like, there's no reason not to know anything anymore.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's like you could be doing these things and be like, oh, yeah, AI could have really helped with this. So you got to try it. And sometimes it works right off the bat. Sometimes it doesn't work because you haven't done it right. You haven't, crafted the query correctly, or you haven't uploaded the data. Whatever the case may be, it's just a fascinating time, and I love your thoughts on that. And again, we're always trying to give advice to leaders in your position. So how do you think about AI? You have a purview over so many areas, and you have lots of people reporting to you. Is this important messaging for you to remember and messaging to get out that, hey, there's this amazing thing that could really help us here?
Yeah, I think it's important to evaluate in anything that you're doing. And so I'll give you a really basic example. When we were transforming from Sutter from a holding company to an operating company, we had a lot of what we called shared services, but our hospitals and our medical foundations had a lot of autonomy. And as a result of that, we ended up with 46,000 policies, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal when you don't know what policy applies. And each entity has their own, and it seemed overwhelming, right? I wanted to categorize these policies, so that we used AI. We actually used AI, and I had a quick snapshot of what it was. I realized that we had tons of duplication, and now we have 11,000 policies, and that's something that probably would have taken us a few months to analyze it, and AI made it easier. And so the way that we look at it at Sutter, and Laura Wild, our chief digital officer, is really like, it's making work easier for us. So let's think about it in that context, and let's look at how AI can solve it. I would tell you that I'm probably her most user-friendly business owner of any of the AI stuff, because I'm constantly looking at how do we analyze things faster? How do we get to the data faster? And then how do we actually solve for greater operational efficiencies? Meanwhile, we have a lot of AI projects on our clinical side, with helping our physicians with documentation, with their in-basket messaging and other things. And we just deployed AI and Microsoft version on our desktop. And last night I got a text from one of my colleagues who said, I've never had an easier time writing a communication. I threw it in AI, told them what to write, and I had to tweak about two things that took me 2 minutes, and I had the communication out, which would have probably taken me 2 or 3 hours. And although when I read it, there's no way she wrote it, because it's a lot nicer memo maybe than she would have wrote, but it's probably what the organization needs, and it saved us a ton of time. So I think there's lots of ways to infuse it. I've been using AI for performance reviews for the last 2 years. Instead of, looking up a better way to articulate to somebody maybe their opportunity, AI can do that for me. And so how can we actually work smarter is the way that I look at it. And I think a lot of, as AI has evolved in healthcare, it goes a lot slower than it has been in other industries. Like, I've been using it for privacy auditing and monitoring for 7 years now,
Oh,
and
wow.
does analytics, pattern recognition, but that's not the norm in healthcare. I would say over the last 2 years, AI has really gotten a lot of attention, but I look at it from, yes, you have to protect the privacy of it, but there's lots of ways that we can embrace it to actually make work easier and to help us actually fast track some of the things that we want to do. And we should embrace it and look for those opportunities. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but it's going to solve, some things that we were, having challenges with or want to do it faster. And I see it particularly in the data space where healthcare, you're analyzing tons of data in short periods of time. It has a real opportunity to be a game changer.
Fascinating stuff. And I'm thinking about, we want to use it, we want people to use it, but I think we're quickly getting to the point where it's not okay not to use it. Now, for
Mhm.
example, what I mean is you have people working for you, doing tasks for you. Someone could use AI and get something done in 1/10 the time, but they're not. Maybe
Yeah.
they have thought of it, or they're just not. They feel like there's something more authentic and genuine about writing that email from scratch and taking 3 hours to do it. That's that's not okay today, and it's
Yeah.
very soon not gonna be tolerated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. And I think, it depends on what generation I see, and who wants to embrace it. But even 2 years ago, our head of HR, I mentioned that I use ChatGPT for performance reviews. And she was like, oh, that you can't do that. That is not okay. That's a policy violation. And I said, it's not a policy violation. Like, point to the policy. And this year, just a couple weeks ago, I received a message from her telling me ChatGPT is awesome for performance reviews. I'm spending half the amount of time just being thoughtful about how to articulate, feedback to individuals. And she's like, I don't have to do that. I can use ChatGPT to help me write this in a better way. And so I think, we're starting to see the evolution of it. And this happened when we rolled out a bridge, which isn't completely deployed here, but I think, people don't want to embrace technology right away. And then when they realize it actually adds value and that it makes them streamline, it makes them have less pajama time, then they're ready to embrace it. But I think we're a ways off from getting all of healthcare to really embrace it. But I don't disagree with you that um, it's a mistake not to, because it actually helps you get your work done faster and you can get to more things.
Yeah, we have to move beyond it makes me I always think of the calculator example. Like, if you're a mathematician and you're using a calculator, does anybody think you're less of a mathematician? No.
No?
They don't look at the person sitting there with a pen and paper and go, "They're doing the real math. You're just
Yeah.
cheating." Right? We don't think about it. It's a tool. Um, so it's just we have to get beyond that mentality, that it's cheating, but we always have to have ownership of the output. I think
Yeah.
that's the absolute key, right? It can never be, "Hey, this has issues," or "I don't like the way this," or "This is not written as we wanted it," and, "Oh, well, it's not my fault. ChatGPT spit it out, and you told me to
Yeah.
use it." No, we own the output, and obviously that's gonna it's doubly true, triply true in the clinical world where this stuff's slowly pervading, right? We have the idea that's deeply embedded of these ambient listening, where we're getting a note. That's one aspect, a much simpler aspect of AI, right? It's
Mhm.
absorbing the discussion and it's producing a note. And that note may become structured data and flow into the EHR. Like there's all kinds of things, but that's
Yeah.
still the AI taking, that data. It's different if we're have the AI going into the EHR and other systems and synthesizing information and producing some sort of recommendation, right? Those are two completely different things.
Yeah.
And the latter is much more involved. It's going to take much more time than the former. Your
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think so. And I like your concept of, you still have to own it at the end of the day. I think that's true of when we deploy AI to help physicians with, writing notes. We also see the benefit in it. It can analyze the entire medical record. So perhaps something that an ED physician might not spot because they're seeing you at one point in time when you're not feeling well versus seeing you over the duration of your healthcare journey. is a big deal because it can actually issue spot and diagnose or recommend diagnosis that obviously you want the physician at the end of the day to own it. But it also has the opportunity to provide better care to patients, just looking at the holistic picture. So I definitely think there's a balance to it. And I've seen a lot of organizations embrace AI and others say, absolutely not, we're not going to do this. We think that, everybody should own it as an original and not use AI as a benefit. And I think those organizations are going to have challenges being successful going forward because that's just not the way the industry is going.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, to me, it's just a no-brainer. This idea of this tool analyzing massive amounts of data and showing you what you may have missed, what you not may not have not gotten time to get to, is a no-brainer. You don't have to do what it says. You can look at something and say, "Well, I don't agree with that," or "That's not relevant." But it's that gem, it's that golden nugget that you go, "You know what? I did miss that," or "I didn't see that," or "I didn't realize that." And that's the gift. That's the beauty. So
Yeah,
it's an
yeah.
augmentation. It's an assistant. Um, and it's all very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about data. You mentioned the data space. Um, one of the ideas that I've been discussing with people recently is, so there's a concept, I read this in an article, there's a concept that we don't need so much to focus on better algorithms. Like, that's not where health systems should be focusing. We have algorithms. They're operating on data that's inconsistently structured, bad data. That's where you need to focus as a health system. You have to get your data house in order. If you've got data at different hospitals that may have been acquired through M&A, where the data structures are different, and you're applying the same algorithm to these data structures, you're going to get different results. We don't want that. So, what are your thoughts around the concept that AI is great, but we've got a data problem in healthcare and we have to work on it?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I definitely think we have a data problem depending on where individuals are. I think you see the bigger systems that have had lots of M&A and the way that they've grown up as autonomous and independent and somewhat connected, but not really connected, more as a holding company versus an operating company. And then I think generally data has been really dispersed among organizations versus centralized. So I know at least at Sutter for the last several years, we have been working on the centralization of data and analytics. I actually partnered with our chief digital officer to centralize all of our data and analytics teams, or the bulk of them, to her digital team to be able to do exactly that, to look at the data integrity, to leverage AI where it makes sense, but also where we have structural challenges. In some cases, we don't even have the same system. And so when like we have a transaction that we did almost 2 years ago now, and they're on a different version of Epic than we are. So their data is completely different. You would think that it might be the same because it's all Epic, but the customization and the data structure is different. And so it's actually not apples to apples. And so we're also pushing standardization of applications so that we're getting the data the same way that we need it. But I would say it's a tremendous opportunity, particularly for big organizations that just has massive amount of data. We had 6,400 SQL databases that were sitting completely unused for a period of 3 years. And nobody knew what they were, but they at one point had been some sort of important evaluation of it. And so we took the approach of, if nobody accesses this for the next 6 to 8 weeks, we're going to start deleting this data because we clearly don't need it. And then I think that the integrating it under one structure, under one leader, really helps drive the standardization and the simplification of data, because we've also overcomplicated it in how we manage it. So we have a navigator that our chief data analytics officer created that has all of our data in one place, but they're going to continue to rendition and finesse that because of the dispersed systems that we're continuing to create this standardization around. So I definitely agree with that. And I think it's much easier to do at a small organization than it is to do at a big organization that's just had this fettering of data over the last 20 years that we're now just trying to fix over a couple of years because we realize how valuable the data is.
Very good. Well, you mentioned, servers that were not, I guess, not being used, right? That type of thing. So, makes me think of audits, makes me think of, what's going on in the news. That dovetails in with the idea application rationalization.
Mhm.
Um, and I'd like your thoughts, and let's stick with your size health system, big, right? Well, that's
Mhm.
where you could get the most benefit from an audit. And let's stick on the IT side. There could be hundreds of applications, maybe even over 1,000, and each application has a certain amount of licenses. Um, and you can, if you did an audit, and I don't know how often these things are done in large health systems, but it seems like, as in the government, that there can be things that are unused, and there can be savings that can be found. I don't know how often audits are done on the IT side, if they're regular, continuous, once in a while, perhaps never done. But what are your thoughts around being a good steward of the resources of the health system, and then how an audit can come into play and help you find these things? And you mentioned the idea of, we're going to watch it for a little bit and see if anybody uses it, right, before we shut it off. So that's kind of interesting as a way to, when you're in a big health system, you don't just yell out in the hallway, hey, does anybody use this, right? So your thoughts around preventing waste.
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous opportunity. So we've been on the what we call the application rationalization journey, or one platform journey, for the last probably 5 or 6 years, where we're constantly in a phase of identifying how many applications do we have, which ones are interconnected and integrated, and which ones are not, and which ones do we actually need to provide care, and which ones do we not. And then also, even outside of true healthcare delivery applications, there's a lot of business applications that are used where, maybe the compliance team has an application, maybe the legal team has an application, maybe your supply chain team has a different contracting system than your legal team does. How do you create the integration between all of those to actually save the organization money? And so I think, if you're sitting in the CIO seat or you're sitting in my seat, you're always looking for operational efficiencies and ways to do things more integrated, more standardized, and more simplified. And so we've been on a journey for a while to do exactly that. And also just have the hard conversations of, there's no reason why we shouldn't have one contracting system here. So let's move to that. Let's move to one ERP system. But I would say it varies depending on priorities. I think a lot of times it's easy to get focused on all the fancy things that you can do, the digital innovation, the AI functions, and not look at on the back end, what are the operational efficiencies that you can get to be a good steward of the money, to then use that to fund the AI initiatives or the innovation applications that you want to do. And I don't see, I've been at Sutter for 12 years, and that, been through lots of change and transition, and that's not always been a priority. I would tell you it's a priority now. But when I talk to many, both integration officers and CIOs across other systems, it depends on whether it's a focus or not. And I see that more of the focus is on less operational efficiency in others, but I would highly recommend audit can help. They can be engaged to do it. And you should be constantly looking at what operational efficiencies do you have? Because what greater thing to develop a relationship with a CFO by telling him or her, hey, I'm gonna, rationalize these applications, save $2 million, and that's the money that I want to use to go invest in AI for our physicians or our care teams.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to me it's very role based, what your focus is going to be in these
Yeah.
decisions, these application rationalization decisions, which tie into a whole nother dynamic of staying in suite versus going with a specialized niche vendor, which is outside a suite. Um, if you are in the CIO seat, you have certain things you're responsible for, certain sensitivities. You're probably going to be more favoring staying in suite. If you're someone with innovation in their title, or maybe closer to the users, um, you may have a tendency to favor the application that's outside of the suite, perhaps because you're not factoring in all those back end things that you mentioned, those extra
Mhm.
costs. You're not really thinking about that. You're not incentivized to think about that. So there's really those 2 sides of that equation where you have different points of view. Ultimately, you need some kind of governance to bubble that
Yeah.
up to a decision. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think governance is really important. And it's not just that, right? What your role is, it's also physicians. And so, in some cases, in big systems, they've, each different hospital or medical foundation might have decided on an application because it's their niche that that physician group really likes it. So I think you have to have them involved in the decision making process. And sometimes I'm not a very patient person. And so I think, it takes a lot longer than you think to actually get everybody aligned on it. But I
Mhm.
think you have to start with everybody agrees that we should only have one, and then let's work on what that looks like. And so we've been on that journey with a governance structure, with physician input, depending on what it is we're trying to consolidate, and trying to keep moving that along to get to it. Like, we're going to deploy Epic at our ambulatory surgery centers this year. And that's been a huge challenge. Some of them are on paper, some of them are completely different systems. And part of it is just the physician engagement of how we get them involved and understanding why this is a benefit to them too. Because when we share patients, the patients want their entire record to be at that surgery center for that day that they received the surgery, not have it not be available and you have to refill out all of your paperwork because you're seen at this specific entity that doesn't have the electronic health record that we have.
Yeah, and we gotta it's so important, uh, when we have these discussions to remember the dynamic in healthcare and the role of the physicians and the gravitas and weight that they
Mhm.
they bring to
Yeah,
any decision. It's just not a reality. I know many of them are, again, not employed by the health system. They can come and go as they please. They don't have to bring their patients, especially in a competitive area. They can go to the
yeah.
hospital across the street that is more sensitive to their feelings on certain things and isn't making them switch applications. So these are all very sensitive, nuanced decisions that don't get made sometimes with a spreadsheet and a number is
Yeah.
spit out, and this is how we go forward. And certainly, if you discount that dynamic, you're not going to be an IT executive, a CIO type for very long.
No, and especially not at a particular organization where the politics are like that, because it requires you to juggle all of that and get to an end goal, because change is hard. And if you don't bring them along on that change journey, and make sure that they're there to endorse it, in some cases, you won't be successful in your role and you won't be able to drive the change that you need to from a technology standpoint.
Very good. Let's talk about your advice for IT executives who are trying to, there are always downward cost pressures, but certainly we hear about it now about IT budgets being cut. Um, but there's such a huge push for innovation, right? So we want it's a, to do more with less, right? We need to cut your budget, but we expect you to be innovative and implement AI and make our physicians happy. And oh, by the way, you can't have any security breaches. Um, so how do you juggle that when you're trying to make everybody happy?
Yeah, I think there's always opportunity for operational efficiencies, even in technology. And, maybe you're not going to save them the exact amount that they want, but I think there's trade-offs that can be done. And there's lots of creative ways to look at your portfolio and identify how can we do this differently. Like, we made a decision to go to Epic hosting cloud. And we knew that the capex would be a quick investment, but the opex would increase in the budget. So we made that decision with full transparency at the senior leadership level about what that looks like as an organization. But at the end of the day, that actually saves us capital that we can invest in growth for our ambulatories. So I think that the role of the CIO is to be really focused on looking for operational efficiencies to help fund what they want to do from a technology standpoint and innovation, and create partnerships with your CFO, your COO, and if you're lucky enough to have an integration officer who gets to focus on operational efficiencies, even better, because there's lots of ideas and opportunities where you can streamline technology to save the money to do the innovation work. And I'm not sure that we always look at the problem in that way. We always look at, oh, we need to spend more money. Okay, well, great, but how do we save money to spend more?
Very good. Let's put on your privacy hat for a minute. I don't maybe it's AI, but what do you see right now as the biggest issues facing chief privacy officers at health systems?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Third party breaches is number one. That continues to be a pretty significant challenge. And then I think data stewardship, both at the organization and everywhere your data is going. And so we continue to see an uptick in third parties impacted by cyber attacks that result in breaches. And then second on the data piece is the other thing with these third parties is that, there's always data going back and forth in healthcare organizations. You're transacting a lot with vendors. And what we're identifying is that these vendors are not deleting the data. They're keeping the data longer than they need to. They're maybe not securing it in the way that we would secure it. And so how do we focus on data guardianship and make sure that they're actually adhering to the contract, which does tell them to delete the data, and they're deleting it? Because we believe, as we've analyzed our third party breaches over the last couple of years, that at least 50% of them could be completely prevented if they would have just deleted the data after use. And so that's a very large focus of us. And then I think the other one is just watching what's going on at the federal level with the reproductive health regulations, which were in midstream implementation. We have cybersecurity NPRM right now and are actually hoping that that rule gets finalized in some way, because it will really help increase the standard for our third parties to hopefully get at least a minimum cybersecurity hygiene, which in all of the breaches that we have been impacted by third parties could be completely prevented with things as simple as multi-factor authentication.
Um, the proposed revision to the HIPAA security rule, is that what you're referencing, or you're referencing a
Yes.
different one? Okay.
Yes.
There's a lot going on. So, okay, that
Yeah.
revision to the HIPAA security rule, what do you think of that? You think they got a good handle on it, or you think
I think they have a good handle on it. I spend a lot of time on the National Committee on Health and Vital Statistics, holding hearings to get OCR information on what they needed for this regulation. And it's been since 2008 since we have had any update to the HIPAA security regulation. If we just think about how technology has evolved, it needs to be updated. And so
Mhm.
I think 99% of what's in that proposed regulation we need from a healthcare perspective, and we're hoping that it'll be bipartisan support to actually get that rule finalized, because it'll help us give us a little bit of teeth with our vendors who can sit, unless it's a law or regulation, they're not focused as much as we are on making sure that patients are protected and compliance with an agreement versus a regulation. They view that differently.
Mhm.
So I think this would allow us to have more focus on regulatory requirements that we could hold them accountable to outside of a business associate agreement.
I don't think it was in that HIPAA security rule, unless I'm wrong. I read somewhere about either the trend or the direction, the movement of giving patients, or the desire of giving patients more control over their data, for example, in an EMR with a health system, in terms of getting quite granular into what data they want to be shared with which physicians and what data they don't, and also having the health systems be more responsive in a more timely manner to changes in those decisions. So I want to share X. I don't want to share this with Dr. X, and then I change my mind. As soon as I let you know, that should be effectuated very quickly, whatever that means. I don't have any times on it,
Yeah.
but you're familiar with this dynamic. Are we moving in
Yeah.
that direction? And the question is, how hard is this to operationalize?
It's really hard. It's really hard. And I'll give you the example of reproductive health regulations, where, today, if that rule doesn't get repealed, there's a requirement to get an attestation before you can release to a third party for certain things. And to just get that from a patient is difficult. And to figure out what part of the medical record it falls into reproductive health rights. It could be their pediatric record, it could be OBGYN, it could be a specialty appointment where you're talking about reproductive health and that on a completely unrelated subject. So I think it's really hard to get that specific in a record that is so robust with all of your medical information, depending on what you decide to share and not share. So for a long time, we've had a regulation on psychotherapy notes where we're not allowed to release psychotherapy notes without the consent of the psychiatrist. And that's worked quite well because the psychiatrist is the keeper of those records. And obviously, it's usually sensitive conversations that you wouldn't want to release to just anybody. But I think if you get to a point where patients get to decide what they want to share with who, it would be very challenging doing that in all parts of the medical record. It's not segmented in that way to allow a patient to easily say, well, I want, these 3 sentences shared, but not these 3 sentences. And so I don't see how today, the way that the electronic health records are set up, that it would be that easy to operationalize it. I think if it's, your record completely and you don't want it being shared with another healthcare organization or you don't want it being shared with a law firm, that's pretty easy. But when you get into specific note types, it gets more challenging because a lot of the note types are very generic. And, when you get into the meat of the actual clinical documentation, it's way more specific. And it's not easy even to separate it by specialty. When we are working on this reproductive health regulation, we're basically going to have to review everybody's medical record that falls into that to make sure that we've caught everything that could possibly be defined as reproductive health. So I think it's just going to be really challenging to operationalize anything like that beyond it being at the higher level of either a distinct note type like psychotherapy notes or just at the patient record level where you could actually restrict the information. And then I think the other thing that is challenging is like during the COVID pandemic, lots of data got shared everywhere and you can't retract that.
Mm.
You can't unshare that data. And so I think patients, when I talk to them and educate them about their privacy rights, they don't necessarily understand that, we might have government mandated reporting where we have to send their information for that purpose or registry information for, state health reasons. And so, to try to then repeal it 20 years after we first had an electronic health record, I think will be really challenging. So what I always try to focus on is what are we actually trying to do? Like, what do they want? Are they
Mhm.
worried about it going a certain place? Or are they worried about their entire record? And where I see the rub often is when they're trying to get life insurance or they're
Mm.
trying to get some kind of insurance where a predetermined condition would deny them the ability to get that coverage.
It's almost a desire to erase, right? I want
Yeah,
that to
yeah,
go
and I
away,
I
but
don't know how you erase 20 years worth of data that's everywhere. So between the government, I mean, during the COVID pandemic, all of the data that needed to be shared for the for vaccines, both with the state and with federal, I personally think, and I tell my family this: your data is already everywhere.
yeah.
So what are you worried about, and then how do you protect it? Because I think you just should make that assumption, because that's just the reality of all the data sharing that occurs.
Yeah, your data is gone, but you gotta
Mhm.
hold on to your identity, right?
Yeah,
Because if
yeah.
somebody gets your identity, now you got a problem.
Yeah, you got a big problem, depending on what they've done with it, right? The worst of the problems is when they're filing taxes and getting a new social security card issued.
Yeah. I'll tell you a real quick funny story. I never remember my dreams. I had a nightmare the other night that, one I fell for one of these scams on my phone, like, a phishing scam, whatever. And I didn't mean to, like it said, push here for yes. And before I could stop my hand, I pushed it. And then I couldn't log into any of my accounts. And it was, but that's a dream. Like, that's because I've been
Yeah.
reading articles. I've been reading amazingly horrific articles about scams, like
Yeah.
real articles about people that have been scammed, and my god, the sophistication of these
Oh,
scams.
yeah.
It's astounding, and you've got people losing hundreds of thousands of dollars, becoming suicidal. It's
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah, the deep fake piece of
Yeah,
these scams now, where, they can use AI to purport as somebody's image on Zoom, that is scary because there's very few people that I believe are sophisticated enough to figure out that that's a scam. It could scam anybody, truly, even me. And, been in the cyberspace for a really long time because it's real. It looks real. And
yeah,
so to not have, checks and balances in place when you're transacting money is you're going to become a victim at some point. And, I've large healthcare organizations have absolutely been victims recently of deep fakes and
yeah,
transacted a lot of money, wired money because
yeah.
of it, and not realizing that it wasn't them. Because normally a scam, if you get a text message or you get an email, you're going to pick up the phone and call. Well, if the other person on the other side is a deep fake, how do you know it's not legitimate? Or you say, hey, can we get on a Zoom and talk about this transaction more? And it's like you're dialoguing with that person in a real conversation. That's what I worry about the most, and just being large, significant impact. And then I think about, you know, um, grandparents, and I think they don't even know how bad it actually could be, right? And they can get faked easily over the phone because that's the generation that they came from. But you give them an iPad and all of a sudden things pop up on there and you've got a deep fake, like they're gonna fall victim. I don't know how you prevent that. And that's what I worry about, is that, the more sophisticated we get with these deep fakes, the more that I don't know if we're gonna know if it's real or not.
Yeah, and it almost paralyzes you in a sense. You're like, "I don't care." Like, whatever
Yeah,
message my bank or Apple or anybody is sending me about something's gone wrong and my account needs delete, 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 delete,
yeah,
delete. I'm not gonna worry about it until I have a problem, until I can't log into my account. I've been getting
yes,
all these emails purported to be from PayPal about, "You just sent this money to this person. If, like, if you didn't mean to do this, call this number. Delete,
mm,
delete," and I check my PayPal account, everything's fine. Delete, 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 and I keep getting them. So
yeah.
you're gonna have to default to ignoring all this stuff, but then if they're, and companies are gonna have to figure out, how do we actually communicate issues to people? Because if, and they put these lists up, like, if this happens, like, we would never do this. We would never send you a text, or we're never going to ask you for this. Well, I can't memorize like who's going to do what. It just gets to the point where, again, you default to no. And there's going to be an effect at some point on companies, health systems trying to legitimately communicate with their patients and users, where they're just ignoring anything. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that people are worried about that. And I think the way health systems, like, we have to look at things differently, because even if you did have that list of the things we're not going to do,
Yeah.
they're not going to be true because of the deep fake opportunities.
Right.
So I think you have to find new ways to securely communicate when you're transacting large sums of money or when you're doing business. And the same thing for patients and others. Like, what are the secure ways that we can communicate with them that are not email, like their patient portal account, where we know that it's a safe space for them to log in and they know that it's legitimately coming from the health system, versus just a generic email or newsletter. And I think texts are the worst right now.
Okay.
They just happen every single day, all day, with scams, and they
Yeah.
they use scare tactics, right? Like, I had a physician recently who was told, if you don't pay, $2,000, we're gonna arrest you, and you're not gonna be able to see your patients for the rest of the day. And so here, this physician believed that maybe they had an old traffic ticket or they had something that created this, and there was a legitimate warrant out for their arrest. So they paid the money.
No.
They didn't want to cancel their patients. And that's a sophisticated, well-educated
That's
individual
amazing.
who
Right.
just, was busy taking care of patients, sees this and responds to it. And so I think with the inundation of information, whether it's text, email, etc. It's just so overwhelming that it's better to ignore it.
Uh, so you mentioned that you don't have the CISO role anymore. That's a good thing in this day and age with all this stuff we're talking about. You at least
Yeah,
don't
I
have to worry about that.
yeah, I definitely I think the chief integration officer role is big, and to have, three very large hats for that are high risk with a very high risk area, I felt like it was time to transition that. And I will tell you that I still get to influence our interim CISO, which I actually prefer over being up at 2 in the morning going through cyber incident response. So definitely still love the area, still focus on it, but definitely don't miss the 2 a.m. incident response.
Yeah, well, nobody needs that. All right, let me just ask you a final question, and I'll let you go. Your best piece of advice for those in let's these are our typical readers are going to be the CIOs,
Mhm.
the CISOs, the chief technology officers, even the CMIOs and the CNIOs. You've had a lot of hats as you mentioned. What's your best piece of advice for those folks?
Yeah, I would say that with the evolution of technology over the last few years and the pressure for digital and innovation, I would say spend a lot of time partnering with your COO, your CFO, your other executive leader colleagues to look for operational efficiency, and to do that within, how do we then reinvest in the organization with what we're able to save, and look at it even from the cyber standpoint as risk. If we have less applications, we have less landscape to protect, and so how do you look at that holistically to actually solve it for the organization and work through, strategy and a game plan for how you could save money while also better protecting the organization.
That's right. Shrink the attack surface, right?
Mhm.
If you can. All right, Jackie, that was awesome. I want to thank you so much for your time today. I think everyone's
Thank
really going
you.
to enjoy this. You have a great day.
Thanks, you too.